a child, anything and everything is possible. The challenge is hanging on to that as you grow up. And for me as a child, aged just 4 years old, my mind was open and I was given the opportunity to try something for the first time. And for me, that was sailing. It was the chance to sail on a boat down on the southeast coast with my Auntie Thea and my nan and my elder brother. And I'll never ever forget that feeling, even at 4 years old, of not only seeing the boat for the first time and feeling the excitement, but scrambling on board and seeing this little world inside that was to be our home. And the most amazing feeling was the first time we hoisted those sails. And as a child, that was the greatest sense of freedom that I could ever imagine. And as I grew up in Derbyshire, about as far from the sea as you can possibly get, I thought of that many times. I started reading as many sailing books as I could get my hands on. From the age of 8, I started saving all my birthday money and Christmas money for a boat. From 11, when I went to secondary school, I started to save my school dinner money change. And every single day in school, I had mashed potato and baked beans and free gravy, and I got through a lot of free gravy in our school. And the rest of the change, I'd pile on my money box. And when that pile reached £1, I'd drop it inside and cross off one of the 100 squares that I'd drawn on a piece of paper. That, to me, was the way to save for a boat. And when finally aged 13, I had that little boat. Ironically, I couldn't afford to put her on a reservoir, so I sat in the garden, dreaming of the sea. And for me, growing up, though I had this incredible passion for sailing, if I at my school had said, when I grow up, I want to sail around the world, I think everyone would have thought I'd be bonkers. Because young people that grow up in Derbyshire do not become round-the-world sailors. It's not something that's even within the spectrum of people that I was at school with. People didn't sail. It wasn't normal. And so at school, like everyone else, I studied hard, and I thought that university would be the pathway to my future. And so I studied as hard as I could. I was trying to be a vet. I love animals, obviously. You see my dog on the stage. And to try and be a vet was a big challenge at school. It was a very, very high results that you needed. I wasn't going to a particularly posh school, so it was a challenging school in its own right. And I was going through school thinking everything counts on this. These results are my entire future. And I started knowing that I would be challenged academically. I started working every Saturday to theatre vets just to gain experience so that I'd have something on my CV when I made my application to university. I studied as hard as I could through my GCSEs, through my A-levels, and then 3 months before I took my A-levels, I was struck down with glandular fever. Now, I was working till 2 in the morning to try and get these grades. The school had already said, to be honest, Ellen, your grades aren't good enough, don't bother applying to veterinary school. So I hadn't. I decided to take a year out, gain more experience, get the results anyway, and then apply. And when you're ill like that, 3 months before your A-levels, you think that everything's over. It's everything you've worked towards since you were 4 years old when you started school, and suddenly everything stops. But that time I had to think whilst I was ill was one of the best things that happened in my life, because it made me reflect. And it made me reflect at a time when there was a TV programme on at 3 a.m. about a whitbread round the world race. A race around the world in boats, which was sponsored. And I lay on the sofa after having recorded this programme on my nan's video recorder we'd borrowed, and I watched the images, the dynamic images of these people who were sailing around the world. That was their job. And for me, that was it. That was what I was going to do. I was going to sail around the world as I'd always dreamt of. But then it became reality, because I realised I could find a sponsor. And with sponsorship, I could go around the world. And from that moment on, I didn't look back. I had a little boat by the time I was 17 that I'd saved my school dinner money change for. I bought her as a wreck. I'd done her up, and I decided when I was 18 years old to set off on my first solo journey. I'd worked at a sailing school on the East Coast for 1.5 years after leaving school. I'd learned so much. I'd saved as much money as possible. I'd worked on the boat, and I got to this moment where here I was going off on a solo journey on my own, 18 years old. The trip took me 4.5 months to get around Britain, a month longer than it took me to get around the world the first time. But I learned so much. That trip showed me what was possible, not what wasn't. And I'll never forget the feeling when I left the lock gates in Hull Marina on that big, brown, wide river where I'd been living for 1.5 years. And my mum and dad had come to see me off, and some of my school friends, and there were a few journalists there from the local paper, and there was all this excitement, and I was leaving, and I'd only had 3 hours sleep, and this was it, I was going. And then suddenly, those shouts, those waves died down, and your world goes quiet, and you're alone. You're alone in a river. And I remember feeling this incredible sensation of being suspended. I felt like the past was behind me on the dockside, and the future lay ahead outside that big, wide, brown river. And there I was between the two, just waiting for that future to happen. And it did, because I met some amazing people on that round Britain. I met people who were involved in solo sailing. I realised that was something that I loved. I was sailing around Britain on my own. As I sailed down the west coast of the UK, the Atlantic was there. If I hung a right, the first land I would hit would be America, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. It was absolutely fascinating to me. So I moved my boat Iduna down to the south coast. I lived on her for 2.5 years down there before moving into a porter cabin, where I lived for 1.5 years trying to find funding to go off on my own journeys. In '96, I crossed the Atlantic twice. I crossed the Atlantic solo in 1997, cobbling together bits and pieces and a boat and borrowing money to get to the start line of a race called the Middle Transat. And then 1998 was the big opportunity, a big transatlantic race from France called the Route de Rome. This would be my springboard into the Round the World race 2 years later. And as a result of sending literally thousands and thousands of letters to potential sponsors, to people who were involved in sailing, as a result of conversations with people, I ended up in a boardroom, September 1998. And I was absolutely petrified. There I was, standing in front of a man who was a CEO of a huge organisation, and I knew he could make my dream come true. One word, yes. And that dream to sail around the world could become reality. And I talked to him about my passion. I talked to him about sailing around the world. And I talked to him about the fact this wasn't about me sailing around the world with his name on the side of the boat. It was about working with that company, taking all of the people in that company on that journey around the world. And he said yes. And can you imagine how it felt? From the age of 4, having dreamt of sailing around the world, to be sitting in a design meeting, designing a boat on which I was going to sail solo around the world. I couldn't believe I was living my life. The first time I sailed her in Auckland Harbour after building her for 9 months, I was absolutely in heaven. If my life had ended there, I would be the happiest person on earth. I was so happy I sailed her halfway around the world in training. And then just 2 weeks later, set off on my first race in her, a solo transatlantic race from the UK to America. I'd never ever raced solo in a 60-foot boat before. I was against 23 other competitors, all who I'd been racing against that winter around the world in the Vendée Globe. I was aged 23. Everything was new. My eyes were huge. I was loving every second of it. But what people hadn't expected, and me neither, was that I'd win that race. And that put a massive amount of pressure on me later that year, because just 6 months later I took the start line of the Vendée Globe. Solo non-stop around the world, no assistance, no support boat goes with you. You're off at sea for 3.5 months. And when I'd begun this campaign, I was the also-ran. I was the girl from Derbyshire who'd managed to find a sponsor. When I started the Vendée Globe, I was one of the race favourites. And for my mum and dad from Derbyshire who don't sail, to watch their daughter, aged 24, go off in the Vendée Globe was a lot of pressure, because they knew how hard I was going to push that boat. And they didn't understand that world that I was going out into. And the Vendée was everything that I ever dreamt. It was absolutely incredible. When you step on that boat to go around the world, you enter a different world. You enter a different way of thinking. Your world doesn't stop at all until you cross that finish line. Day and night, all linked together. You don't sleep at night, you sleep more in the day. The boat's charging through the ocean 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You're looking at the weather, you're looking at the computers, you're looking at the information, you're charging your batteries. You're physically working hard to change the sails. You're trying to predict everything that's happening. You're taking multiple inputs from everything from the shape of a cloud in the sky, right down to a map on your computer, to a sound the boat makes. All of this information you're taking in, you're processing it, and you're trying to make the right decisions to get that boat around the world as fast as possible. And to describe that world is very hard, but I have a little video clip which I filmed by jamming the camera in the back of the boat. And when you sail in the Southern Ocean, the waves are big. You can imagine a big wave, everybody can. You can imagine being on your own in the middle of an ocean, never seeing the land, just watching the horizon the whole time. But the noise is the thing that you can't imagine. And I think this video clip just illustrates what it's like to be on that boat. tired and you're at sea for months on end, how do you wake up? Well, I challenge you to sleep on that boat doing that speed, because the noise is deafening. You know, that camera was outside, not inside. Inside, the boat's like a speaker. You hear every wave, every noise, every gust, every little tap of every bit of equipment when it rattles against the boat. And you have to understand all those noises. It's a fascinating place to be, and I was absolutely loving it. I saw the huge albatross in the Southern Ocean, with this being one wing of a wandering albatross. That's one wing. They're twice this width, and they fly behind the boat. Incredibly. I saw icebergs in the Southern Ocean, the biggest a kilometre long. I saw 9 in one day, just in a row, right along the Antarctic convergence. I saw the most beautiful sunsets that I could ever imagine in my life. In the Southern Ocean, where the air is so pure and clear, and the oranges and reds just leap out at you, looking like the centre of a fire. All of this was what I dreamt of. I dreamt of sailing around the world. And that was the focus. The focus until the moment that finished gun fired, when I crossed the line in second position, was that finish line. Because until I'd crossed that line, I hadn't achieved my goal. I hadn't sailed around the world. And what I hadn't expected when I crossed that finish line was just how much my life was going to change. Because my dream had been to sail around the world. And when I crossed that line, it was an amazing moment, because the team and my mum and dad jumped back on board. We then entered a channel, a 1 mile long channel that went down to the pontoon where I moored up. There were hundreds of thousands, literally, of people who'd come from all over France to see the finish of this incredible race. 2 of us finished over a weekend. Michel in first on Saturday, me in second on Sunday. So there were literally thousands of people who'd been there to see this finish. And they were all jumping up and down and screaming and waving with banners they'd written. It was absolutely extraordinary. You feel like you've landed in someone else's party. So you're happy. You jump up and down and you celebrate because everyone around you is. But the next picture, for me, doesn't show happiness. That was taken half an hour after I stepped off the boat. And when I see my picture, my face in that photo, I see fear. I see fear because when I stepped off that boat, I'd lost my anonymity. And you don't realise how precious that is until you don't have it anymore. The moment I stepped off that boat, my life had changed forever. And my dream hadn't been to find that. It had been to sail around the world. It was one of the hardest years of my life, telling everyone, actually, I was the same Ellen, despite the fact I'd been in papers and sailed around the world. It doesn't change who you are. It's just something a bit crazy to go and do for a few months. And I knew in my heart of hearts, my goal was sailing. I loved sailing. It was the passion that drove me. And the first thing I wanted to do when I crossed that line was go back to sea again. In fact, I didn't want to get off the boat. It took me 2 goes to get off the boat, because the first time I got to the railings and I couldn't get off. I had to go back in the boat again and breathe deeply for a few minutes before I could actually build up the energy to climb off. Because the moment I left that boat, that was the end. It was over. It was totally and utterly over. But within 6 months of that moment, I decided, quite crazily, to go around the world again. I didn't announce it for 2 years, but I decided to try and be not the person to win the Vendée Globe, but the fastest person ever to sail solo non-stop around the world. That was the goal, to be the fastest person in history around the world. And that needed a different boat. So immediately after the finish of that race, I started training. Training with my French friends. I did a 2-handed transatlantic on this boat. That was a training session. You can see they're even wetter than Kingfisher. They're quite lively boats. They can go into all sorts of different positions. Remarkably, they didn't capsize. There were 11 people sailing that boat, and they still got into that situation. And ditto with this, 11 people on that boat, and they obviously did capsize. And the thing that I found staggering, when you look at the right-hand side, you see those figures hanging off the net. And you see just how big the boat is, but more importantly, you see how far down the sea is. Now that's in broad daylight. Imagine cartwheeling a boat that big in the middle of the night, 2,500 miles away from the nearest town. Because that's exactly where I was going with the boat we were building for my round-the-world record. And this situation I know very well because I'm one of those 5 figures. We capsized 60 miles offshore. We're in the middle of a race, 5 of us on board. I was inside the boat getting something to eat, having a laugh with my mates. And then there was a little tap. And 5 seconds later we were upside down in a world that was thrown into darkness, up to our knees in water, trying to get outside the escape hatch to find one of our best friends who was trapped under the net. And in 5 seconds, you can go from laughing to someone's life being in danger. Because the faster the boat goes, the higher the risk. These boats are really, really fast. They're incredibly powerful. And I guess it's a bit like driving a car. You know, if you're driving a car at 10 miles an hour, it's actually not stressful. I mean, you can do that without concentrating too much. Take that to 30, 60, it gets a lot more stressful. You take that car at 120 and you're white knuckle holding onto the wheel, you're strapped in your seat and you're doing all you can to keep that car on the road. That's what it's like going around the world faster. The faster you go, the more stressful it becomes. The more stress, the more adrenaline which pumps around your body day and night. And I think that moment when I crossed the start line in that boat, which was bigger than those ones you just saw doing cartwheels, she was 75 foot long. We'd built her over a year. I'd sailed her halfway around the world in training. I'd got her to New York. I'd done a transatlantic record to try and prepare for the round the world. Missed out by 73 minutes. Then a few months later, went to Falmouth to be on standby for that round the world. Now, when we built her, no one ever in history had made it round the world in a multi-hull. A multi-hull being a boat with these big stabilisers. They're much faster, they're much more powerful, and as a result, they're much more dangerous. Many had tried, but everyone had failed. Whilst we built her, a Frenchman took a 90-foot boat, 15 feet bigger, around the world, which was designed for a crew of 10. He took it solo, and he took the record that I was trying to break from 93 days down to 72. And everyone said that's unbreakable, it's going to stand for a decade. And it deserved to. To sail that boat around the world was an extraordinary feat in itself. But what it meant was the following winter when I set off, I really had a high bar to get over because I knew that smaller boat was going to have to be pushed so hard for the whole time around the world. And everyone in the team knew that too. The adrenaline really did pump, and that morning when I crossed the start line, I was just full of it. And that adrenaline did not ebb in my body until the finish line was crossed 71 days later. And you do, like in the Vonda, enter a different world. And this was an even more different world because the level of stress sailing this boat was quite extraordinary. And you end up in this place on the boat where you manage everything that you have. So you manage your own energy. You try and sleep when you can, although generally that's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, occasionally an hour, very rarely 2 hours, and only once in 71 days did I sleep for 3 hours in a row. So you're living at the pace of the weather systems that are around you. If the wind is gusty and up and down, you can't sleep at all. The worst I got was 20 minutes sleep in 3 days because it was too dangerous to sleep because 5 seconds with a gust, the boat's upside down and you can't wake up and release ropes in that time. So you're living at this different pace and everything around you is your little world. The sails, the boat, it's only 75 foot long, but it's plenty. You've put everything that you need for that record on that boat. All the spares, and you will have problems, you'll have to use them. All the food, 475 litres of diesel I took on that boat, nearly half a tonne, on a boat that was trying to be as light as possible, just to power 2 computers and an autopilot. And the computer screens were off all the time when I wasn't actually physically looking at them. You're so connected to everything that you have on that boat. And I wrote a log from the Southern Ocean, and I'd just like to read it to you. Log entry from B&Q, 16th of December 2004, 05:35 local time, heading east-southeast beneath South Africa, plunging deep into the Southern Ocean to pick up more pressure. Water temperature 5 degrees, risk of icebergs, slept 2 hours in the last 24, no sleep possible now. A few thoughts for a very wet morning whilst we await the passing of a wet and rainy front. I look out of B&Q's windows and see big grey waves and monotonous drizzle. Our world is closed in around us, and we can see very, very little other than the 400-metre radius around the boat. We have more wind than I would have otherwise imagined, but we're sailing along okay. I was thinking in the early hours of this morning about life on board, and what are the differences between what we have here and what we experience on land. I think the first thing is that this little world of B&Q and I feels like a small island. We hope that we shall have all we need, and we'll have to improvise for what we have not. There is only so much of everything, so each square of kitchen roll and each few centimetres of tape get you closer to having none left. Everything is checked before it goes in the bin, just to be sure it's not wanted. You need to be resourceful and tackle problems rationally and simply as they arise. There will always be problems, always. You just hope that they'll be surmountable and dealable with. The rest is a logical waiting game. It's funny the way your mind works when you're sitting on a boat in the midst of a huge grey expanse of beautiful ocean. That's it for now. Ellen. And until that moment, my life at sea had always been entirely separate from my life on land. It had been like entering another part of my life, stepping into a different zone. But when I came off the finish, at the finish and stepped off that boat, I began to question, is our world any different? What you develop on that boat is an overwhelming understanding of the definition of the word finite. Because what you have is all you have, and you can't get any more. And for the first time, I started to adapt that thought to our life on land. We too live in a finite world. We only have so much of so many resources. And that began the beginning of a new journey, which led me to making a decision that I thought I'd never make. And I guess for me it was like picking up a stone. I was living my dream job. I loved everything I was doing, but I just started to feel something different. I started to think about the much greater world and the challenges before us, and I had two choices. I either put that stone back down again and carried on with my dream job, or I put it aside and I found out more. And that's exactly what I started to do. In 2005, I started to learn, I started to talk to people, I started to discover this huge challenge that lies ahead of us around resource management. For me, that was at the heart of it. We only have so many of these resources, and we're ripping through them in an incredibly linear fashion. And the more I learned, the more I realised this was a massive challenge. The more reports I read, the more people I spoke to. I couldn't believe that a lot of this stuff I hadn't learnt at school. I couldn't believe our dependence on resources, which were ultimately limited. It was absolutely fascinating to me. And I started to work with local councils, I started to work with the government, I sat on the DCSF Zero Carbon Schools Task Force. I worked with local farmers on the Isle of Wight to discuss the challenges they were faced with. I talked to young people. I tried to pick up as much information as I could on this subject, bit by bit, doing more of this than of the actual sailing. And I started to work with power generators. I visited massive power stations. This photo was taken in the burner of a coal-fired power station down on the east coast. And that burner was 180 feet high. And it obviously wasn't lit, else I wouldn't be here. But when it is, it went up to 2,000 degrees Celsius. To see the size of one of these things that's probably generating the energy that's lighting these lights here today was awe-inspiring. We can build these massive power stations that create this energy. It absolutely fascinated me. I've always been fascinated by engineering because that was such a huge part of fixing things on the boat and building them in the first place. And the guys that worked there were doing the nation a service in keeping the lights on. They were running that power station just like I'd run a ship, making sure that nothing breaks, making sure the energy keeps flowing. And this power station was run on coal. And coal was a subject which was very close to my family's heart because my great-grandfather was a coal miner. This is a picture of him. Peter King, born in 1894. And when you look at that picture, you see a different world. You see a different era. You think that's stepping back in time. And in some ways it is. But this is me with my great-grandfather. And by the way, they are not too brilliant. He was alive until I was 11 years old. And I remember sitting on his knee listening to his mining stories. I remember him talking about the pit ponies and the fact that when they retired from the mines, they'd live in the fields around the pit entrance. And the miners would save them across to their sandwiches and they'd take them to the ponies at lunchtime. I remember him talking about the camaraderie down the mines and the fact that I'd learned to understand that at sea through working so closely with a team of people. It absolutely fascinated me, and his stories, even today, feel to me like they were yesterday. And on part of this journey of learning, I picked up all sorts of reports from the International Energy Agency reports on the future of oil, through to visiting a webpage, which was the World Coal Association, to talk about the use of coal. And I was staggered when I looked at the webpage, because in the middle of the webpage, it had 119 years. Coal will last us for at least the next 119 years. And I thought to myself, well, that's outside my lifetime. And then I thought back to my great-grandfather. And I realised he was born 117 years ago. It's nothing. I sat on his knee till I was 11 years old. And I realised how short this time is, and how quickly we're using these resources that were at one stage so plentiful, but now actually are not. And it was on realising that I made that decision I thought I'd never make. And that was to leave solo sailing behind me and get involved with this challenge full time. And I had choices. I could have sailed around the world on a boat saying, use less, painted green, I don't know. I could have done all sorts of things. And I thought, maybe I should use what I do so well to raise awareness. But I thought, I don't want to raise awareness. I want to do something. This is a massive challenge. So began the journey to the creation of the foundation. And more conversations to understand so much more about what needed to be known. And to me, it was learning. I was learning. And I felt when I was sailing around the world that the way that I processed things was through feedback. I'd go and make a few decisions, and I'd make them as best as I could with the information around me, and then I'd look for feedback. How was the boat reacting? How fast were we going? What were the other competitors doing if it was a race? And I felt, in a way, I needed that feedback in this world. And so I started to learn more, and I started to share some of the facts and figures, and I realised actually it wasn't just energy. I'd initially thought about energy because on the boat energy is so precious. You manage it down to that last drop of diesel. But I started to look into materials as well, materials we have once in the history of humanity. And a couple of years ago there was a report written by the New Scientist, and it said resources, there's 40 years of tin, 46 of zinc, 61 of copper, 45 of gold, 42 of lead, and 13 of indium that sits in the screen of everyone's mobile phone. And I thought, well, actually, we're using finite resources in a linear way. This can't work long term. There's a fundamental challenge with the way that our lives function. And so I started to talk to people. For my feedback, I talked to the public about these things I was learning, just as I have in front of you today. I talked to the journey to deciding to leave sailing behind, the decision I never thought I'd make, and I started to talk about facts and figures. And I found that when I stood on the stage, people listened, they were fascinated. When I talked about the facts and figures, they wriggled in their seats. They weren't comfortable. And nor was I talking about them, because it's not a great thing to hear. But when I got to the end of the presentation, and people came up to me and said, I get this. I understand this. I can see there's a massive challenge. What can I actually do? All I could say was use less. And using less didn't seem like a solution. Yes, efficiency was vital. We need to be efficient with what we have, but using less, if we do, better and better each year, buys us more time. It doesn't fix it. We make things more and more efficiently, but we still make them in a linear system. And so long as we're in a linear system, we're going to keep eking things out a bit longer. If you're a business and you make things more efficiently every year, it doesn't mean that you found a solution in 20 or 30 years. You've just bought yourself time. And I felt if you're a young person growing up today, and the objective of your life, the advice that we can give as the next generation is use less, what can you actually do? If your objective is to minimise your footprint, what can you actually do in your life? What is okay? Or is everything negative? Do you actually question whether it's better if you're not here anymore? And I found that fascinating because when I was a kid, I had a dream to sail around the world. And I knew exactly where I was going. My life wasn't about what I couldn't do, it was about what I could. It was about maximising that. I didn't know how I'd get there, but I was going to find a way to get there. And I felt that at sea, when I'd been faced with challenges, the way I dealt with them, the way I dealt with the massive seas and the risk was thinking through to the other side. Yes, things today are pretty crap, but tomorrow they'll be better. And that's how you get through. You look at the other side. And I realised there was a need for me in this space, when I was trying to understand this new subject, to look through to the other side. What does the other side look like? What is the solution? And I started to speak to more and more people. And I came across this concept of the circular economy. This isn't my idea. The Chinese government have put it in their 11th five-year plan. The Dutch government are working towards this with billions of pounds of procurement money in different products. But the nice thing with understanding the circular economy was it turned things on its head. It was a different way of thinking. It turned the linear system that we live in today, whereby we make things more and more efficient, but we can't actually rethink things, to a different way of thinking entirely. A different way of using materials, a different way about thinking about energy. And it absolutely fascinated me. And I'll give you a few examples. Currently, when we talk about plastic bags, we see that as being very negative. Plastic bags, we're trying to ban plastic bags, it's a bad thing. We have issues with packaging, and we have a lot of rubbish in our bin at the end of the week. I do, and when I see it, I feel guilty. And guilt is not something that inspires creativity, which I feel has to lie at the heart of how we can fix this going forwards. But if you think about making a plastic bag from a different material, such as this one, this is made out of a totally non-toxic biological material, and that can be composted to become food for another cycle. That can become farm fertilizer. And then I thought, well, actually, if you make all your your consumables out of a material that's food for another cycle, then when you have all that in your bin at the end of the week, or the end of the day, then it's something positive. This is positive, not negative. And one of the biggest challenges we have in the future is food and feeding ourselves, and half the world is fed using phosphorus, which is a finite resource, dug primarily out of mines in Morocco and China. That's a huge challenge going forward, but if we can create our own fertiliser through things that currently are waste, by turning them into food, that's very positive. And what fascinated me about this biological nutrient idea, because this idea sits around biological and technical nutrients, kept separately, this can actually build capital. Rather than eke things out a bit longer, you can actually improve the value of the farmland. You can build capital. And that fascinated me, because for a young person, That's the opportunity to do something extremely positive, and the more they do of that, the better. And then there's technical nutrients. This is a pretty boring carpet tile, not dissimilar in looks from the carpet on the floor here. But the company that makes this make this differently. They design this for disassembly. So you can rent this, you don't have to buy it. And at the end of its rented life, or if you buy it when it goes back to the manufacturer, which they've created trolleys to make sure happens, they take the carpet apart. They put it through a machine, they deconstruct it. The yarn, the red bit, gets sent back to the manufacturer to be depolymerized, then repolymerized into the yarn for the new carpet. So to reduce rate, because they're providing the raw material. The base, which on this one's bitumen, but on their new carpets is a material polyolefin, the base gets melted down and then turned into the base of the next carpet. And they do that using primarily renewable energy, and by 2020 it'll be 100% renewable energy. Now if you're an industry doing that, that can work long term. That can work in 100 years' time. Because you're cycling materials, and importantly, you're not just recycling, but you're keeping the materials at the same level. You're keeping the value in the material. Because when you recycle and downcycle, it's ultimately always going to end up either in landfill or as road aggregate. And then we can't get these valuable materials back out again. And we only have them once in the history of humanity. It's looking at them differently. And I guess if you mix the two together, you can think about different ways of thinking. It doesn't just have to be a boring product like a carpet tile or a plastic bag. A washing machine is quite a complex product. But currently, the companies that make washing machines design them so that ultimately they will break in 5 or 7 years. And the idea is that they'll sell you another one, and that's their business model. Selling a new machine to make money. They build the machine as efficiently as possible. So they have the minimum amount of materials in them, so they can make them as cheaply as possible, but still do the job. But if you bought 3,000 washes rather than a machine, then maybe they build a different machine. Because they own the machine, you just buy the washes. You actually don't need to own a machine, you want clean clothes. So they make a machine which is built differently so that A, they can repair it, but they can also get the materials back out of that machine when they have to upgrade it and turn it into a more efficient washing machine. And if you're a washing machine manufacturer, you look at the news, you'd be well aware of the cost of the products that go into your machine. Copper last year went up by 30% in price. You'd want to control that going forward. You're a business. And I started to realise, through the work that I'd done with companies, talking to CEOs, that I noticed a change in the language. To begin with, when I'd started to learn about this, everything sat in CSR. Sustainability, CSR, it was in one space. It was about ticking a box on a report at the end of the year. And over the 5 years I've been learning about this, this was becoming a board decision. Sustainability was whether this company would actually exist in 50 years. Because the way they make things, the way they produce things, isn't something that can carry on for the long term. And that was a really important shift and vital when we created the foundation. We launched the foundation on the 1st of September last year, an educational charity. A charity set up to inspire the next generation to rethink, redesign and build a positive future. And we needed funding for that. And I was used to going out there finding funding for Sailing Project because I'd done that for 15 years. And all our funding for that foundation comes from the corporates. It comes from the business sector. And we went out a year after the financial crisis to try and find funding for an educational charity. And we raised a significant amount of funding because these businesses realised the future would be very different. And they realised that they needed to change the way they did things, the way they thought about materials going forwards. And more importantly, they realised, and this is the CEOs, they realised they needed different skills coming out of education in order to do that. And when we talked to them about this idea of the circular economy and cycling materials, they could see that rather than taking a little bit less material, making a little bit more out of it and selling it for a bit more, which was currently what they're doing, wasn't a long-term solution. But when they started thinking about different business models, and this is happening, one of our founding partners is B&Q. 2 weeks after the launch of the foundation, he stood up at a business conference, and his first line was, maybe in the future, retailers like B&Q don't sell anything anymore. Imagine what the business audience said. And actually, he was thinking about cycling materials. He was thinking about, rather than buying a 29 quid crappy drill, which you know won't last that long, because it can't, because it's not made to last. You spend 3 or 5 quid and you rent one that you know will do the job brilliantly because it's designed to do the job, and they keep the drill, they can repair the drill. That's a great business model because people come back, they come back into the store with the drill once they've rented it. And they're starting to think about this very seriously because ultimately they have to, because nobody makes these materials anymore and their business model is entirely dependent on them. National Grid, another one. National Grid in the next 10 years is investing £42 billion in the energy infrastructure in the UK, And we had our first meeting with the CEO, and his words were, we do not have young people leaving education to do this. They don't have the skill set, they're not interested enough in engineering, and we need to rethink the way we do things. At the latest leadership conference at National Grid, their top 1,000 people were doing a challenge on the circular economy to see how they could redesign parts of National Grid. Now, at the moment, young people don't leave school with the skills needed to rethink things. I didn't. I didn't even come across this 5 years ago. But this is about the subject of sustainability being taught in a slightly different way, whereby young people see the opportunities. And part of the work we're doing with the foundation is in secondary education. And I'll come on to higher education in a minute. In that secondary education, we work with STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering and maths. We work with the Nuffield Foundation to create a STEM Futures pod based around the principles of the circular economy. We've also just finished an outreach project where we work right across the country with 1,000 A-level students. And we set them a challenge in each event. And the winning team from these events won an internship within one of these founding partner companies for a week, set a challenge to redesign part of that company, and at the end of the week present that to senior management or above. In some cases, it's going to be the board. So it's a massive opportunity for them. But the challenge we set them throughout this outreach was, after landfill, what next? And what was fascinating was these young people don't say, how are we going to deal with this plastic at the end, or how are we going to deal with these challenges? They say, why do we have this waste in the first place? Why don't we design it out? Right from the beginning, when we start to design products, don't we design them differently? They realise there's a massive systems level change that has to shift. We don't talk to them about behavioural change, we talk to them about redesigning the future and the opportunities that holds, and they get that, they totally get that. We've had young people talking about making products and materials like Lego. Lego, you can make 1 million things out of it that look absolutely spectacular, but you can take it all apart again and you can use the pieces. They were able to think outside the box, they're able to think in a totally different way, and it's so inspiring to spend time with young people who are looking at the opportunities. They see the positives, they see that it's a huge challenge to redesign the future, but it's entirely possible. It's absolutely not outside the question. We started working with higher education. We ran a business and education conference at the end of last year with Bradford University. We're running a postgrad cert in the circular economy through Bradford. We're doing work with the Manchester University Leadership Programme. Further education is the area where we have the least partnerships, and we're looking for opportunities to share this model and share this idea in the best way possible with groups of further education colleges. Because we believe there's such potential in young people leaving education with this positive outlook. And if you think about two people, and we were discussing it, the team at the foundation earlier today, think about two young people that leave school with exactly the same qualifications, having done the same degree or the same BTEC course, whatever it is, and they get to there and they're in the job interview. One of them is entirely positive, saying, we can do this, we can redesign this. And the other one is thinking, well, actually, we've got a huge challenge in front of us, and I'm not sure how we can make this happen. The positive one will get the job because of that outlook and because of their passion for what they're doing. And I think if you want to inspire young people, show them the opportunities. I got given an opportunity at 4 years old, which inspired me and changed the course of the entire rest of my life. If I hadn't sailed around the world, I wouldn't be standing here in front of you all today with a foundation. It wouldn't have happened like that. So these things can really alter the course of our lives. And when we did the pilot project for our outreach project around the country, we were in London, we worked with a group of A-level students, and we were walking around the room, and we've got Professor Bill Scott from Bath University is doing all our evaluation. And he walked past a table with some girls on from one of the London colleges, and he heard one of the girls say, this circular economy, interesting, I think there's going to be some really exciting design jobs here. And that's exactly what it is. Redesign things, rethink things, let's change the whole system, let's change the whole framework. And it creates such an incredibly positive agenda. And when I question what we're doing, and I question the scale of the problem, because I went through a period of learning about this subject where I thought I have no idea how we can do this. Now I see that there is a way to do this, and it involves everybody working towards a positive agenda. But when I question, I think about what's happened in my great-grandfather's lifetime. Think about the year he was born, 117 years ago. There were only 25 cars on the road in the entire world. 108 years ago, he was 9 years old. He remembers this. We as humans flew for the first time in history ever. Now we have planes that can carry 555 people, and there are 4.9 billion air travellers. 82 years ago, we discovered penicillin. We saved millions of lives all over the world. 71 years ago, the first computer. Many said it wouldn't catch on, but it did. And just 20 years later, it was a microchip, of which there will be thousands of in this very room here today. 42 years ago, we didn't just look at the moon, but 7 years before I was born, we actually went and stood on it, with less computing power than you'd find in a calculator. 32 years ago, the first mobile phone, wasn't that mobile? But now they are. And the most important, 21 years ago, we discovered and developed the internet. If ever there is a time when we can redesign the future, it's right now. Because we can have an idea here in this room and we can share it with the world in seconds. We've not had that ability before, and now we do. So I believe this is entirely possible, and there is an incredible opportunity through inspiring the next generation to do exactly that. And there's one phrase that we use at the foundation which sums up the spirit of what we do. And that is, if you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work and give orders, but instead teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. Thank you.
Any questions for Alan? Hands up. We're overwhelmed. Right, there's a question at the back. Any other questions in this area? All right, let's have that one first. Sorry, Nick, I'm looking around there.
Hi. How did you decompress when you got back from the long journeys that you made, with all that lack of sleep and concentration issues?
I think initially when you return from a long journey, you're full of adrenaline and you're very excited to see everyone again because you haven't seen anyone for 3 months. The difficulty is when that adrenaline wears off because it fuels you, and it has fueled you for months. But then your body is utterly and totally exhausted, and mentally you're exhausted. And I think that's the hardest thing to get across, is the mental exhaustion. And lots of things change when you're at sea and you're living with that much adrenaline. For example, food, you never feel hungry. Food is not something nice, it's a fuel. And when you step off the boat, you are not desperate to have a fresh, tomato or salad or steak and chips. Actually, you have no interest in food whatsoever. I remember the first time we went out with a team, for a meal after the finish, and they're like, "What do you want, Ellen?" And I'm like, "I really don't care, just anything, just choose something, really, it just doesn't matter." Because your whole body's learnt that it's living on adrenaline, it's not making choices about what's nice, it's living in a different space. So that kind of thing, I don't know if you call that decompressing, but it takes time for your body to get back down to what's normal, if the way we live is normal. That's also a question you ask. Yep.
Question here?
Sorry.
Hello, Alan. David Summerville from Edinburgh University. You started to say about some of the programs you're working with higher education.
Yes.
I wonder if you could expand on that and where you see your foundation and the work that the partnering you're doing with Higher Education Academy and so on.
This year.
What would you like to be doing by the end over this next 5 years?
It would be a big thought to think that within the next 5 years, the next generation will be thinking differently about their future in a very positive way and understanding opportunities. That's ultimately where we're trying to get to. It's about young people, and it's about, importantly, linking young people with business. Because that's not something I mentioned so much in the talk, but the link with business that we have is vital. To give these young people opportunities within our founding partnerships is important for their learning and their development, but to case study with all the material that we present to young people, and we work with young people with, to case study what's really happening out there in the business world is really important. And this different way of learning where you mix subjects together and you take on real challenges. For me, when I was trying to sail around the world, that fascinated me, learning about lots of different things and real challenges. So that type of learning is something that we feel really opens up the mind of young people, as we saw so clearly with the outreach programme. But to come back to HEA, we have 2 workshops, there's one in Edinburgh, one in London in this spring, and that's a workshop in the circular economy, and that's aimed at higher education. So to try and help people to understand what this is about and learn more about it, and just give people opportunities to learn more about it at that level. But it's about a multi-pronged approach going in at different levels. We start in secondary school with the STEM work that we're doing that we partner with Nuffield on, and we do the outreach projects, but we're developing as the foundation grows and as we take on different areas in more depth, and we're looking for partnerships. And as I mentioned, further education is a big area for us. How do you translate this into opportunities for people who are studying to be electricians or or gas fitters or technicians, whatever it might be. There's some incredible opportunities around this way of thinking and this framework, but how do you actually make that work within schools and colleges?
Thank you. This question here, and then this lady here.
Yes, you mentioned standing in front of CEO, wondering whether the answer is going to be yes or no. How do you see that process working with our CEOs, with Vice Chancellors, to help engage them in this yearning for the vast and endless sea?
I wish it was as simple as yearning for the vast and endless sea, but yes, you're right. I think that on this journey I've felt to begin with, there are almost two ways of looking at this. And I think the way that the foundation has chosen is the big systems level change. In that actually we need to redesign the way we make things and the way we do things, which is a lot longer term challenge than behavioural change, because that's not where we focus with the foundation. It's about the opportunities of the future to redesign things. And I think what's interesting when it comes to universities and the outlook of the Vice Chancellors and the people that physically run the universities, it's opportunity for the future. You know, education is there to provide the experiences and the knowledge for young people to carry on with their lives. And if you think about young people entering education last September, they won't retire until 2070. So if that's the goal of education, to prepare people for their futures, and we don't know what the future is going to be like in 10 years, let alone 50, then actually exploring the opportunities of doing things differently is something which I think is really important. And to back that up, you know, the feedback we've had from industry and business around this subject is so positive. They need these skills. And I think when you link those two things together and you talk about young people leaving education or further education, higher education, whatever it is, with the skills needed to rethink and rebuild things in what will be a very different world, then that's the university's role to provide that. And this is one way of looking at it, whatever it's called in the future circular economy or whatever, but we know that, you know, long term this idea works, because for billions of years materials have cycled and we've never had waste, and then we come along and we create this notion of waste. Stuff that's useless, and actually everything can enter another cycle. That's the whole principle. So looking at that long term, I think is where it's at, and the need for business to have the skills from those young people. I think that's absolutely vital, and that's why we got those partnerships. It wasn't because they wanted to tick a box on their CSR report. They're doing it because they need people with different skills. So I'd say that's where the motivation lies for those people, and we are looking at, I'm obviously here doing this talk, and I do a lot of talks on this subject, but we try and target exactly the right people to help to drive things. But it's, you know, we can't do this alone. This is about partnerships with organisations. It's about people getting on board with this. And ultimately, it's about learning this in every subject. It's not an add-on. It's about looking at materials differently in all different subjects. So it goes right across a university or further education or even in A-levels. It's many more than one subject.
Can I ask, though, that in your 6-8 months of this foundation and this relationship with the sector, what's the reaction?
I'd say hugely positive. I think the opportunity is what people keep coming back with. There's a huge opportunity to do this. We see this from business, we see this from young people, and we also see this from educators. The educators that we've worked with when we did the outreach project with the 1,000 A-level students, we took each of the teams of 6 from the schools came with a teacher, a representative from the school. They all went and did training on the circular economy around how to teach it, from the head of learning of the foundation, Ken Webster. They came back so positive. It was a real motivator to look at things differently. So the feedback's been incredibly positive, but the challenge is to make it happen. It's, you know, you can have it was a great idea to say around the world, but how are we going to make that happen? You know, it's that kind of thing. And you know, if people believe that this is a very strong idea, and certainly business is showing that, you know, a different way of thinking about things is vital, then we need to make that happen. And it involves getting this message to young people in a way where they can see the opportunities, in a way where they understand cycling materials, when they become material scientists, going into fashion, whatever it is. It's about translating an idea into the reality of what these young people learn. But it has been very, very positive. But the question is, how do you do it?
This lady here has a question.
Hi,
Here's the microphone.
So Hannah Park from the University of St Andrews. First of all, thank you for a fantastic presentation. I guess it kind of goes along very much what you just said. You keep using the word opportunity, but I think through in particular the financial crisis, it's been a big eye-opener for a lot of people, I think, in the sense that people are seeing that as that reducing their ability to move forward and take opportunity, real opportunity. How do you propose
for those of you who couldn't hear at the back, the question's around opportunity and how do you translate that opportunity to the general public. And people who would generally be more interested in celebrity culture or, accumulating stuff, as is often the case. I think that what's really vital in this is the framing and how you communicate this subject. When we set up the foundation, the goal is not to get to the general public. The goal is to get to young people to inspire them. That's our objective through working with business. So the work with education and business is vital, but the large part, by a long way, is education, and the smaller part, business with the case studies. But the framing is vital. And we set out when we were putting together the material for the foundation, and we talked as a team, and the team grew, and we discussed exactly what we'd do. One of the things that we were discussing was we wanted the message of the foundation to be as relevant to the top-tier audience as someone studying environmental science. And I think when you base it on resources and redesigning the future, actually it is. And I think that's vital when it's not to say getting people on board, but when this message of redesigning an opportunity is being shared, because if you want to be a Formula One designer in the future, there's a great opportunity to redesign a Formula One car in a cradle-to-cradle way, or in a circular economy way, so you can recover the parts. You can design things differently. It doesn't need to say that you can never do that in the future, but there's maybe a different way of doing it. Now, energy is a huge challenge, absolutely, and we totally understand that. The information that we have from National Grid for us is absolutely vital. We're in the process of putting together a future of an energy package at the moment. So there are lots of challenges within this opportunity. But I think what we talk about is the opportunity for work. Young people, we spend a lot of time with young people, not anywhere near as much time as you spend, but we spend a lot of time talking to young people, and a job is one of their biggest issues. They want a job. They want to see there's somewhere for them to go in the future, and they understand that opportunity. And from the young people that we had at the workshops, they could see there were some incredible opportunities in design and rethinking, and even just around the idea. And I think to come back to the idea, and we talk about the consumer culture, what we look at is not saying you can't do this, this, and this, but actually, if you rethink this, if you buy all your shopping from the supermarket and it's all packaged and it's all got packaging on, because maybe all of it needs to and some of it maybe doesn't, but that packaging can be positive because you've got a bin full of stuff that goes into a composting facility, which is council run, whoever, or industry run, and then that fertilizer goes onto the farms. That's not a bad thing because it's a cycle. It's a closed cycle. If you look at we talk about insights from living systems sometimes when you're looking at cycling of materials, because in life itself, materials endlessly cycle. As I said, there is no waste. When you look at a tree, an oak tree needs one acorn every 500 years or 300 years, however long it lives, to replace itself. Every year there's thousands. There's an abundance of stuff. But if it fits within a system, then it doesn't have to necessarily be something that's eking things out. It can be a restorative cycle. So I think we encourage the young people to think differently about things. To think differently about how the phone's made, so you can recover the materials, or how waste is viewed, and they can see opportunity. If you want to go into nutrient cycling from a biological nutrient perspective, and you're a young person, the faster you grow that business, the better. It's amazing. It's an opportunity. It's something that needs to be done, and it's very positive and restorative. That's how we tend to frame the opportunity.
I get a question here, and I think this might have been the last one.
Thank you for a great talk. There's a lot going on in the further education, but it's also they've got a lot on their plate because of finance and all that sort of thing. But what I would be really keen is if we could open up an opportunity somewhere in the southwest, because I think we've got a number of colleges which are really engaged in this agenda. And rather than just think of one college or one thing, why don't we just think of a more interesting and broader activity, maybe covering a city or a number of areas.
Absolutely, and that's why when I was talking about further education, we were saying we want to work with groups, if possible, of colleges, because it's very hard to do one thing in one. You want to try and spread that as far as possible.
No,
Absolutely.
We'd be delighted to help.
Fantastic. We come and speak to us afterwards. That'd be great. Thank you very much.
Okay, and finally, Hannah.
Thank you. Hannah Smith from Kingston University. So I think probably most of us in this room would entirely agree with you that the issues in the sustainability agenda is something that is vital to underpin the learning and skills sectors. We're nodding here. But you're talking about kind of this is something that business needs and we need to positive, inspiring people, blah, blah, blah. But we're also nodding. However, it's something that isn't necessarily... As institutions, we don't feel that pull. We aren't feeling it. Yeah. At the moment, the framework... the core business is set up to still channel students through without these things being underpinned, because there's no pull through. We're not being kicked by business actually.
Yeah.
Because we'd move on it, I think. So where, through your experience of this, where are you finding those links? Where are the pulls, and why are we missing them?
I think it's quite interesting. I think this is just beginning within this different framework, for sure. We've seen changes within the businesses we work with have been incredible. We work with Cisco and BT. They already have a team of 22 people on rethinking products for the future. It's happening, but it's at the beginning. But I think when you think about education as a whole, and you think about education and inspiring young people and giving them the skills they need for their futures, and we know things need to change, then it's about a mixture of business needing those skills, but also education providing the skills those young people will need. And we feel that the work we've done with businesses absolutely shows. National Grid came on board because they knew they needed different skills coming through education. They do vast amounts of work through lots of different channels, through taking people from National Grid into schools to talk to them about engineering. Lots of different things happen in this space. But I think, there is no question the future is going to be vastly different. And there is always that challenge of who moves first. Now, we can see businesses moving, but it will take time to change. We were in Holland in November, for example, doing some filming. There's a video on the website about the circular economy in Holland. We visited lots of different businesses. We went to universities. They were teaching students around the circular economy and cradle-to-cradle products, which is products which can effectively have a materials flow which infinitely cycle. They are the first to admit their education is behind the business. The government put £42 billion of their procurement money towards towards companies that were making products that were working towards cradle-to-cradle products. 42 billion. And yet, we sat with one of the government ministers in Holland and they said education is just not where business is. We're behind on education. We have an opportunity in this country to be ahead with education. To inspire people, give people the skills to think differently. And I think that's a vast opportunity. And, I guess it comes back to, we can see that business, when they understand this framework, absolutely run with it. We can see that time and time again, more and more. And that's from CEO driving, not from sustainability. That's the CEO saying, actually, our business needs to change, and that's happening. But I think also, if you'd have gone to the general public and said, what do you want? No one would have said they wanted an iPad. But Apple made them, and actually that's something that works for millions of people all over the world. So part of this is innovation, and part of this is creative thinking. And I think what we're asking young people to do is be creative around their thinking, because we need to be more creative than ever in history to design ourselves this different future. But I think education needs to be creative too. But I also understand it's an incredibly difficult time, as the point was raised about further education with financially and colleges and funding. It is a difficult time, but we still need to be creative, because that objective of that institution is still to provide the skills and inspire those young people for the rest of their lives. That was a long answer to your question, but I hope it answered it.
Please join me in thanking Dame Ellen MacArthur.